The year is 2000. Enron Corporation is named America's Most Innovative Company by Fortune magazine for the sixth consecutive year. Its stock price is soaring past $90 per share. Its annual revenue has crossed $100 billion. Its Houston headquarters stands as one of the most impressive corporate buildings in the United States. 20,000 employees go to work every morning believing they are part of something extraordinary. The future of American energy. Wall Street analysts are calling it a revolution. Business schools are teaching its model. Politicians are lining up to take its donations. 14 months later, Enron would be completely bankrupt. Thousands of ordinary employees would lose their entire life savings. Billions of dollars would simply vanish. And the men who built it, the men who stood on stages and told the world that Enron was the greatest company on earth, would be exposed as some of the most sophisticated and destructive fraudsters in corporate history. This is a story of Enron, and it is not simply a story about greed, although there is plenty of that. It is a story about how an entire system, the auditors, the banks, the regulators, the analysts, the media, and the government, can be so completely deceived by a small group of confident, intelligent, and utterly dishonest people that the entire machine keeps running long after it should have collapsed. It is a story that should not have been possible. And yet it happened, and it happened at the very top of American corporate culture. To understand how Enron fell, you first need to understand what Enron actually was and how it got there. The company was founded in 1985 in Houston, Texas, as a fairly straightforward natural gas pipeline company. Two smaller regional energy companies, Houston Natural Gas and InterNorth, merged together and created Enron, with a man named Kenneth installed as its chief executive. For the first few years, it was a conventional business. It owned and operated physical pipelines. It bought gas on one end and sold it on the other. Nothing glamorous. Nothing scandalous. Then the energy markets in the United States were deregulated during the late 1980s and early 1990s, and everything changed. Deregulation meant that energy could now be traded on open markets, the way stocks and commodities were traded. Kenneth saw this coming before almost anyone else, and he hired a man who would transform Enron from a pipeline company into something the world had never quite seen before. That man was Jeffrey Skilling. Skilling was a Harvard Business School graduate, a management consultant from McKinsey, and one of the most intellectually aggressive executives of his generation. He had a single transformative idea for Enron: stop being a company that owns physical assets and become a company that trades contracts. Stop owning pipelines and start selling the right to use pipelines. Stop delivering gas and start selling the promise of future gas. Enron will become not an energy company, but an energy trading company, a kind of bank for commodities, making money on the spread between what buyers would pay and what sellers would accept. Skilling called this the asset-light model, and he believed it was the future of American business. The genius of this idea and the danger of it was that it made Enron extraordinarily difficult to understand from the outside. When you own physical pipelines and deliver physical gas, anyone can verify what you have and what it is worth. But when you are trading complex energy contracts that span years into the future, when your assets are relationships and derivatives and financial instruments rather than steel and concrete, the true value of your company becomes a matter of opinion. And Enron, it turned out, had very specific opinions about its own value, opinions that bore almost no relationship to reality. The central fraud at Enron was built around a specific accounting technique called mark-to-market accounting. Under normal accounting rules, a company records profit when it actually receives money. If you sign a contract today to deliver gas over the next 20 years, you record the profit as it comes in year by year, as the gas is actually delivered and paid for. Enron, under Jeffrey Skilling, obtained special permission from the Securities and Exchange Commission to use mark-to-market accounting instead. Under this method, the moment Enron signed a long-term energy contract, it could immediately book the entire estimated future profit of that contract as current revenue, even though the money had not been received and would not be received for years, and in many cases would never be received at all. What this meant in practice was breathtaking in its audacity. Enron would sign a contract, estimate the profit on that contract as generously as possible, often using wildly optimistic assumptions about future energy prices, and immediately declare that profit on its financial statements. The revenue would appear in the books. The stock price would rise. Executives would receive bonuses based on the reported earnings. And then the actual business of delivering on those contracts would quietly underperform. The losses would be hidden elsewhere. And the next quarter would require even larger contracts to generate even larger paper profits to cover the gap left by the previous quarter. It was, at its core, a pyramid scheme dressed in corporate accounting language. But mark-to-market alone was not enough to hide the growing losses. For that, Enron needed something more creative, and they found in a man named Andrew Fastow, the company's chief financial officer. Fastow was, by any objective measure, a financial genius, the kind of person whose intelligence made him dangerous. He created a network of hundreds of off-balance sheet entities, special-purpose vehicles, shell companies, limited partnerships, with names like Raptor, Condor, and Jedi. These entities existed primarily to do one thing: absorb Enron's losses, so that those losses never appeared on Enron's official financial statements. The way it worked was deeply sophisticated, but fundamentally dishonest. When one of Enron's investments was losing money, Fastow would transfer that investment to one of his special-purpose entities. The entity would take on the loss. Enron's books would remain clean. The problem, which everyone involved understood but nobody at the relevant regulatory bodies seems to have caught, was that these entities were not genuinely independent. They were backed by Enron's own stock. If Enron's stock fell far enough, the entities would collapse. And if the entities collapsed, their losses, all the losses that had been neatly hidden away, would come flooding back onto Enron's balance sheet all at once. It was a financial time bomb with a fuse whose length depended entirely on how long the stock price stayed up. And the stock price stayed up because the financial statements looked healthy. And the financial statements looked healthy because the losses were hidden in the entities. And the entities were guaranteed by the stock. It was a perfect, self-reinforcing circle of deception. None of this would have been possible without the cooperation, whether through active participation or through catastrophic negligence, of several institutions that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. The first and most damning was Arthur Andersen, one of the 5 largest accounting firms in the world, and Enron's auditor. Arthur Andersen had a legal and professional responsibility to independently verify that Enron's financial statements were accurate. Instead, Arthur Andersen signed off on statements that were demonstrably false, collected enormous fees from Enron, more than $50 million per year in both audit and consulting work, and when the investigation began, shredded documents related to the Enron account. The firm was subsequently convicted of obstruction of justice and effectively ceased to exist. The collapse of Arthur Andersen remains one of the most consequential regulatory failures in the history of American finance. The investment banks were no less culpable. Institutions including JPMorgan Chase and Citigroup helped Enron structure financial transactions that were disguised as energy trades but functioned as loans that kept cash flowing into Enron without appearing on its balance sheet as debt. The banks understood what they were doing. They were well paid for doing it. And they did it anyway because Enron was a prestigious client, because the fees were substantial, and because the financial industry's culture that era treated regulatory risk as simply another cost to be managed. The Wall Street analysts who covered Enron were, with almost no exceptions, recommending the stock write-up until nearly the end. Some were genuinely deceived. Others faced institutional pressure not to publish negative analysis of a company that was generating investment banking fees for their employers. The conflict of interest between the analysis side and the banking side of major financial institutions, a conflict that Enron exploited with extraordinary effectiveness, would later become one of the central concerns of post-Enron financial regulation. And then there was the board of directors. Enron's board included experienced, credentialed, and supposedly independent members who were supposed to provide oversight of management. They suspended the company's own code of ethics, twice, to allow Andrew Fastow to personally manage the special-purpose entities that were hiding Enron's losses. They received the presentations. They asked some questions. And then they approved the arrangements that made the fraud possible. Whether through negligence, willful blindness, or active participation, the board failed at every level. The unraveling began in the summer of 2001, when a woman named Sharon Watkins, an Enron vice president, wrote a now-famous internal memo to Kenneth warning him that the company's accounting practices were fraudulent and that Enron might be about to implode. Lay received the memo. He passed it to Enron's lawyers, who happened to also be the lawyers who had helped structure the problematic arrangements. No corrective action was taken. Watkins would later become one of Time magazine's People of the Year as a whistleblower. What actually brought Enron down was a combination of a falling stock price and a moment of unexpected public scrutiny. In August 2001, Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned as CEO just 6 months after taking the role, citing personal reasons. The resignation was deeply unusual and alarmed the markets. The stock, which had been declining for months, began falling faster. As the stock fell, the special purpose entities that depended on Enron's stock price began to wobble. In October 2001, Enron announced a $618 million loss for the third quarter. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation. Enron restated its financial results, admitting that it had overstated earnings by nearly $600 million over 4 years. On December 2, 2001, Enron Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. It was, at that moment, the largest bankruptcy in American history. The stock price, which had stood at $90 per share just 14 months earlier, fell to less than $1. 20,000 employees lost their jobs. Many of those employees had their retirement savings, their 401k accounts, invested heavily in Enron stock because the company had encouraged them to do so, and because the stock had seemed so safe for so long. Those savings were gone. Not reduced, not damaged, gone. The criminal reckoning came, but it came unevenly. Andrew Fastow pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges, cooperated with prosecutors, and served 6 years in federal prison. Jeffrey Skilling was convicted of multiple counts of securities fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 24 years in prison, later reduced to 14 years. He was released in 2019. Kenneth was convicted on 6 counts of fraud and conspiracy, but died of a heart attack in July 2006 before he could be sentenced, which under federal law meant a conviction was vacated. He died without serving a single day in prison. Arthur Andersen's conviction was later overturned on a technicality, but the firm had already ceased to exist. The Enron scandal produced the most significant reform of American corporate law since the Great Depression. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 required corporate executives to personally certify the accuracy of their financial statements, making a criminal offense to sign off on false reports. It separated audit and consulting services. It created new oversight for accounting firms. It imposed stricter requirements on corporate boards. These reforms were significant. Whether they were sufficient is a question that the 2008 financial crisis answered with some force. What Enron ultimately demonstrated is something that is uncomfortable for the financial world to acknowledge, that markets are not self-correcting in the short to medium term when fraud is sophisticated enough, and when the institutions designed to detect have financial interests in looking the other way. For years, everyone who should have caught Enron, the auditors, the banks, the analysts, the board, the regulators, either could not see it or chose not to. The system that was supposed to make fraud impossible had been so thoroughly captured by the same culture of short-term profit and unchecked confidence that it became instead the system that made fraud possible. The employees who lost their savings did not have the same information as the executives who sold their stock before the collapse. Kenneth sold more than $70 million worth of Enron stock in the 2 years before the bankruptcy, while simultaneously telling employees that the company was strong and that they should hold their shares. Jeffrey Skilling sold tens of millions as well. The people at the top of Enron knew, or certainly should have known, what was real and what was not. And they used that knowledge not to protect the company, not to protect the employees, and not to protect the investors, but to protect themselves. That is the true heart of the Enron scandal. Not the complex accounting, not the offshore entities, not even the staggering scale of the losses. The true heart of it is that a group of highly intelligent, highly educated, and highly rewarded people looked at 20,000 employees and millions of ordinary investors and made a deliberate decision that those people's futures mattered less than their own. The lights in Enron's Houston headquarters went out in 2001. They have never come back on.